In 1950, in a town so small most maps didn't bother to name it, an old man walked into the governor's mansion of New Mexico and said 6 words that should have been impossible. "I am Billy the Kid." He was nearly 90 years old. His hands shook. His body was mapped with scars from wounds he said he'd received in gunfights. Most people only knew from dime novels. Billy the Kid, Henry McCarty, William Bonney, whatever name you want to use, had been shot dead by Sheriff Pat Garrett on a dark night in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, on July 14, 1881. That was the historical record. That was the settled fact. 69 years settled. But this old man, a Texan who went by Brushy Bill Roberts, didn't just claim to be Billy. He had evidence. 5 survivors of the Lincoln County War had signed sworn affidavits saying they recognized him. He knew details about Billy's life that had never been published. He had scars in the right places, and he wanted something very specific, the pardon that a governor had promised Billy the Kid in 1879 and never delivered. What happened next, in a room packed with hostile strangers, flashing cameras, and the children of the very lawman who claimed to have killed Billy, would destroy an old man and ignite a mystery that burns to this day. Was Brushy Bill Roberts a fraud, a delusional old cowboy swept up in the Western movie craze of the 1950s? Or had the most famous outlaw in American history been hiding in plain sight for 7 decades? By the end of this video, you'll know every piece of evidence, for and against, and you'll understand why this story still haunts historians, genealogists, and the people of one small Texas town. If you're fascinated by the unsolved mysteries hiding inside history's most famous stories, hit that like button and subscribe. We dig into forgotten chapters like this every week. Now let me take you back to 1881, to a dark bedroom in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and the gunshot that was supposed to end everything. But to understand how an old man in Texas became the most controversial figure in Wild West history, we have to go back, way back, to the legend itself. Billy the Kid is one of the most mythologized figures in American history. By the time of his reported death, he was already a legend, a young gunfighter, barely 21, who fought in the Lincoln County War of 1878. That war was a brutal conflict in New Mexico territory, a vicious frontier struggle that pitted rival factions of ranchers, merchants, and hired guns against each other in a fight over land, cattle, and political control. It wasn't a noble cause on either side. It was money and power dressed up in gunsmoke, and it produced larger-than-life characters the way only violence can. Billy, born Henry McCarty, sometimes called William Bonney, ended up on the losing side, but his daring escapes and reputed body count made him a folk hero even while he was still alive. He was young, charismatic, and dangerous. There's a famous tintype photograph of him that for decades convinced people he was left-handed, until someone pointed out the image had been reversed. Even his portrait couldn't tell the truth straight. He was the kind of man the frontier manufactured, half myth before he was even dead. In 1879, New Mexico Governor Lew Wallace, the same man who would write Ben-Hur, offered Billy a deal: testify about the murders and corruption of the Lincoln County War, and receive a full pardon. Billy cooperated. He testified. He put himself at risk, and then Wallace, consumed by his literary ambitions and pressured by political allies of the men Billy had testified against, quietly abandoned the deal. He left New Mexico. The pardon evaporated, a promise made in 1879 and broken before the ink was dry. 2 years later, on July 14, 1881, Sheriff Pat Garrett tracked Billy to a bedroom at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. The official account: Garrett entered the dark room, Billy spoke, Ken S., and Garrett fired. Billy the Kid was dead at 21. Garrett became famous. He wrote a book about it. The legend calcified into fact. For 69 years, no one seriously questioned it. Now, here's where the story shifts from legend into something stranger, something that feels less like history and more like a fever dream. Because legends, especially Western legends, have a way of refusing to stay buried. In the decades after Billy's death, whispers circulated, not loudly, not in respectable company, that Garrett had killed the wrong man, that Billy had slipped away in the dark, that someone somewhere was living under a different name with a bullet-shaped secret lodged in his history. These were barroom rumors, nothing more. The kind of talk that drifts through frontier towns like tumbleweeds, weightless, rootless, gone by morning, until 1948, when a probate investigator in St. Louis opened a file on a dead man's estate and heard something that would change his life. The man who heard that whisper was named William V. Morrison, and the trail it led him down would end in the strangest courtroom drama in the history of the American West. It was 1948. William V. Morrison was a paralegal in St. Louis, working a routine probate case, settling a dead man's estate. Unremarkable work, the kind of paperwork that fills filing cabinets and empties coffee pots. But one of the contacts in the case was a man named Joe Hines. Hines was old, weathered, and full of stories, the sort of man who'd lived through things the 20th century had tried to forget. And he told Morrison something extraordinary. He claimed to have been Jesse Evans, a gunfighter who rode in the Lincoln County War alongside Billy the Kid. That alone would have been enough to raise an eyebrow. But Hines went further. He said Billy didn't die in 1881. He said Billy was still alive, living under an alias, in Texas. Morrison was skeptical. He was a legal professional, not a treasure hunter or a dime novel enthusiast. But the details Hines provided were specific: names, places, events that checked out against the historical record. Threads that, when pulled, didn't unravel but held. Morrison started pulling harder. The trail led to Hico, Texas, a town so small it barely registered on a map. And there Morrison found an old man who went by Brushy Bill Roberts. What Morrison found in Hico wasn't a cowboy playing dress-up. It was something far more unsettling. Brushy Bill Roberts was a local character. Everyone in Hico knew him. He told frontier stories, swapped tales at the general store, kept mostly to himself. He'd married a woman named Melinda Allison in 1945. He had no close family alive to speak of, and according to the records, he was either about 90 years old or about 71, depending on which records you believed. This was the first crack in the story, and it mattered. Roberts claimed he was born William Henry Roberts on December 31, 1859, in Buffalo Gap, Texas, near Abilene. That would make him roughly 90 at the time of Morrison's visit. But other records linked him to an Oliver P. Roberts, born in 1879, who assumed the Brushy Bill identity sometime after 1910. That's a 20-year discrepancy, and it was the kind of gap that either proved a cover-up or exposed a fraud. There was no comfortable middle ground. Physically, though, Roberts was compelling. His body was a frontier topography, scars from gunfights and illnesses layered across his frame, each one a story he could narrate in detail. His eyes were distinctive, pale and sharp, matching certain historical descriptions of Billy the Kid with unsettling precision. He carried himself like a man who had lived hard and survived things he shouldn't have. Old age had bent him, but it hadn't erased whatever had shaped him. Morrison sat with Roberts, and in 1949, Roberts confessed. What Roberts told Morrison was detailed, specific, and at times impossible to verify, which was exactly what made it so tantalizing. He recounted episodes from the Lincoln County War that had never been published. He filled in gaps in the historical timeline, undocumented events, obscure names, specific sequences that a casual reader of dime novels or a fan of Western movies wouldn't know. He spoke not like a man who had studied Billy the Kid, but like a man who had been Billy the Kid. Morrison was cautious but increasingly convinced. He began to build a legal case, methodically, the way a paralegal builds anything, one document at a time. He tracked down 5 surviving associates of the Lincoln County War, men who had been there, who had known Billy personally, who had fought alongside him or watched others fight alongside him. He brought them to meet Roberts. Every single one signed a sworn affidavit. This man is Billy the Kid. 5 sworn affidavits from men who fought in the Lincoln County War. Think about what that means. These weren't fans or hobbyists. These weren't men who'd seen a photograph and nodded along. These were men who had watched friends die next to Billy the Kid, and they said this old man was him. Morrison believed he had enough. He contacted the state of New Mexico to request what Roberts said he'd wanted for 70 years, the pardon Governor Lew Wallace had promised in 1879. The governor of New Mexico agreed to a private hearing. What he delivered was anything but. To understand what Roberts wanted, you have to understand what was taken from Billy the Kid, or, if you prefer, what was taken from the man who claimed to be him. The 60-year-old promise that was never kept, that was the wound Roberts said he carried. Not the gunfights, not the years of hiding, not the decades of living under someone else's name. The betrayal. Billy had done his part. He'd testified, he'd cooperated with a governor who swore the pardon was real. And then that governor walked away, left the territory, and wrote a best-selling novel while Billy was left holding nothing but a target on his back. If Roberts was telling the truth, he'd carried that betrayal for 70 years, a promise made by a territorial governor, abandoned before the consequences could land on anyone important. Roberts didn't want fame. He didn't want money. According to Morrison, what he wanted was simple: the pardon he'd been promised, official recognition, a debt paid. He wanted the debt paid. Morrison drafted the petition. He assembled the affidavits. He wrote to Governor Thomas J. Mabry of New Mexico, requesting a private meeting to present the evidence. The governor agreed. But here's where it gets strange, because what Roberts and Morrison thought they were walking into, and what was actually waiting for them, were 2 very different things. Governor Thomas J. Mabry was a politician, not a historian. But he understood that Billy the Kid was more than a historical figure in New Mexico. He was a cultural institution. The state's identity was built, in part, on the mythology of the frontier. Pat Garrett was a hero. Billy was a villain who'd been brought to justice. The story had a shape, a beginning and an end, and that shape held the weight of tourism boards and school textbooks and civic pride. Reopening that story, admitting that Garrett might have killed the wrong man, would be politically explosive. It would turn a hero into either a liar or a fool, and it would turn a settled chapter of history into an open wound. Then there were the Garretts themselves. Pat Garrett's children were still alive, still prominent, still fiercely protective of their father's legacy. Their father had killed Billy the Kid. That was the story their family was built on. If Brushy Bill Roberts was telling the truth, then everything the Garrett name stood for was a lie. They had no intention of letting that narrative take hold. Morrison and Roberts didn't know it yet, but the private hearing had already been compromised. Word had leaked, reporters had been tipped off. The Garrett family had been invited, or had invited themselves. The governor's mansion was about to become a stage, and Roberts was walking into a trap. November 1950. Roberts, his body already fragile, makes the journey from Hico, Texas to the governor's mansion in New Mexico. Morrison accompanies him. Roberts' wife, Melinda, stays behind. She believes him. She married him in 1945 knowing, or believing, that her husband was the most famous outlaw in American history. She has watched him carry this secret, watched him tell stories that no one else could verify. And now she watches him leave for the meeting that could vindicate everything, or destroy him. Roberts is frail. He's old. He has those scarred hands, those pale eyes, the 5 affidavits, and a lifetime of stories. But he's walking into a room where every institution, the state, the press, the Garrett legacy, has a reason to want him to be a fraud. Morrison has staked his professional reputation on this. He's not a crank. He's a paralegal who followed the evidence, interviewed the witnesses, and built what he believes is a legitimate legal case. But he's about to learn that evidence doesn't matter when the verdict has already been decided. November 29th, 1950. The date that would either resurrect Billy the Kid or bury Brushy Bill Roberts forever. The hearing was scheduled. Morrison and Roberts arrived at the governor's mansion expecting a private meeting. A small room, a table, the governor, perhaps an aide, a chance to lay out the evidence calmly, methodically, the way Morrison had built it. What they found instead was a room packed to the walls, reporters with notebooks, photographers with flash cameras, armed guards stationed along the walls, a detail Morrison hadn't been told about, strangers, officials, and in the front row, staring at the old man who claimed their father had lied, Pat Garrett's children. Morrison looked at the room and knew. This wasn't a hearing. This was an ambush. Roberts, nearly 90, stood in the doorway. The room stared back at him. The cameras were already flashing. What happened in the next hour would break an old man's body and ignite a controversy that has never been resolved. The room is hot. Too many bodies, too little air. Flash bulbs pop like small explosions, white light, then after image, then another flash before the first one fades. Brushy Bill Roberts stands just inside the doorway, blinking against the glare. He expected a quiet room. Instead, he stepped into a circus with teeth. Governor Thomas J. Mabry sits at the far end of the room, flanked by aides. He does not rise. He does not greet Roberts. The message is clear before a single word is spoken. This is not a conversation between equals. This is a tribunal. Reporters crowd the sides of the room, notebooks open, pencils already scratching. Photographers jostle for angles, their cameras raised like weapons. The scratch of pens on paper fills the gaps between flash pops. And in the front row, unmistakable and unmoved, sit Garrett's children, watching. Morrison's stomach drops. He's a legal professional. He prepared for a hearing, depositions, affidavits, a structured presentation of evidence built over months of careful investigation. What he got is something else entirely. The room has already decided. The question being asked isn't whether Roberts is Billy the Kid. The question is how quickly they can prove he isn't. Morrison tries to take control. He steps forward, begins his presentation. He references the sworn testimony, the 5 men who had been there, who had known Billy, who had put their names to legal documents. He gestures to Roberts, to the scars, to the documented knowledge. He speaks clearly, methodically, the way he'd rehearsed. But the room isn't interested in his binder of documents. The room is interested in the spectacle. Roberts is already rattled. The cameras won't stop. The faces staring back at him are hostile or hungry. Reporters looking for a headline. The Garrett children looking for vindication. The governor looking for a way to end this before it can begin. This was supposed to be a legal proceeding. It had become a firing squad. Morrison presses forward despite the chaos. He begins laying out the evidence piece by piece. The 5 sworn affidavits from men who had fought alongside Billy in the Lincoln County War. Men who had survived that brutal conflict and who said under oath that this old man standing before them was the same young gunfighter they'd known 70 years ago. He references Roberts' knowledge of undocumented events, details about the Lincoln County War that had never appeared in any book, any newspaper, any dime novel. He points to the scars mapped across Roberts' body, scars that correspond with historical descriptions of wounds Billy the Kid was known to have received. Every piece of evidence is met with skepticism or outright dismissal. The governor's team isn't examining what Morrison presents. They're performing a rejection. The rhythm of it becomes almost mechanical. Morrison offers evidence. The room pushes back. Morrison clarifies. The room ignores the clarification. It's a hearing in name only. The Garrett children are particularly hostile. Their presence in the front row is not passive. It's a gravitational force pulling the room toward a predetermined conclusion. Pat Garrett's children sit like a jury that has already voted. Every word Morrison speaks lands against their folded arms and stone faces. Their father killed Billy the Kid. That is the story. That is the history. And this shaking old man from Texas is not going to rewrite it. If Roberts is Billy, then Pat Garrett, folk hero, lawman, the man who tamed the frontier's most dangerous outlaw, is exposed as either incompetent or complicit in a lie. The Garretts will not let that stand. The counter-evidence surfaces now, deployed like ammunition. The 20-year gap that no one could explain, the discrepancy between Roberts' claimed birth year and the records that told a different story. Someone brings up a report from the Austin American-Statesman suggesting Roberts had once claimed membership in the Jesse James gang before pivoting to the Billy the Kid story. In this room, that detail becomes a grenade. It paints Roberts as a serial fabulist, a man who tries on dead outlaws' identities like hats until one fits. Morrison pushes back. He notes that the association with J. Frank Dalton, the man who had publicly claimed to be Jesse James, was exaggerated by the press. Roberts had appeared with Dalton but had denied gang membership himself. But nuance has no purchase in this room. The narrative is already set. Roberts is a fraud riding the wave of the 1950s Western movie revival. Films like The Kid from Texas, released that very year, had made Billy the Kid front-page news again, and the implication hangs in the air like gun smoke. Roberts is a crank capitalizing on a cultural moment. Nothing more. But then Roberts did something no one in that room expected. The old man, who had been standing silently while Morrison fought for him, begins to speak for himself. He doesn't recite facts from a history book. He doesn't parrot dates and statistics. He tells stories, specific, granular, personal stories from the Lincoln County War, events that hadn't been published anywhere, names that only someone who was there would know, sequences of events that Morrison hadn't coached him on and couldn't have because Morrison himself hadn't known them until Roberts spoke them aloud. For 30 seconds, maybe a minute, the room shifts. The reporters stop writing. The Garrett children uncross their arms. Even the governor leans forward, almost involuntarily, because the old man isn't reciting. He's remembering. His voice, old, cracked, unsteady, suddenly becomes precise. The trembling in his hands quiets. He speaks the way a man speaks when he's not telling a story but reliving one, when the words aren't retrieved from memory but lived through again in real time. For one suspended moment, the room holds its breath. Doubt flickers across faces that had arrived certain. The moment doesn't last. The cameras resume their assault. The questions turn aggressive. Multiple people are speaking at once. Reporters calling out, aides murmuring to the governor, someone in the back of the room laughing. The governor's team presses Roberts on dates, names, sequences, a rapid-fire interrogation designed to trip up an old man under duress, not to discover the truth. It's the kind of questioning that would rattle a witness half his age in perfect health. The flashbulbs fire in bursts now, one after another, turning the room into a strobe. Robert's hands are shaking again, not the gentle tremor of old age, but something sharper, something involuntary and wrong. His face has gone pale beneath the relentless white light. Morrison sees it from across the room and tries to intervene, tries to call for a break, but the room has its own momentum now, and it is merciless. Roberts falters. His speech becomes confused. He stumbles over a date, contradicts something he said minutes earlier. The room pounces. To the Garrett children, this is proof. To the reporters, this is the story. The old fraud crumbling under pressure, the headline writing itself. To the governor, this is the justification he needed all along. And then it happens. Robert's body betrays him, whether from the stress, the heat, the relentless flash of cameras, or the sheer weight of 70 years of carrying a secret no one will believe. Something breaks. Robert staggers. His hand goes to his chest. His knees buckle. Morrison is on his feet, pushing through reporters, reaching for the old man. The cameras keep flashing. Someone calls for a doctor. Someone else keeps asking questions. The room fractures into noise and motion, but at its center stands a man who is collapsing. Physically, completely. Roberts appears to suffer a stroke, right there in the governor's mansion, under the lights in front of the children of the man who claimed to have killed him 70 years ago. The hearing is over. Governor Mabry delivers his verdict. He speaks for less than a minute. The claim is rejected. The historical account stands. Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid on July 14, 1881. The bullet that had built a legend remained the final word. In less than an hour, a man's life was dismissed. Mabry thanks Morrison for his time. He does not thank Roberts. He does not acknowledge the affidavits, the witnesses, or the stories that made the room go quiet. He simply says, no. 6 men swore under oath. A governor shrugged. Morrison helps Roberts out of the room. The old man who claimed to be Billy the Kid leaves the governor's mansion in worse condition than he entered it, and with nothing, no pardon, no recognition, no vindication. He walked in with 5 witnesses and a lifetime of scars. He walked out with nothing. The immediate aftermath unfolds in silence. Morrison and Roberts leave the governor's mansion. The reporters write their stories. The angle is already decided, the old fraud who crumbled under questioning. The Garrett children have their vindication. The governor moves on to the next item on his calendar. But Morrison doesn't move on. He's seen what happened in that room, not a fair hearing, but a political execution. The evidence wasn't weighed. The witnesses weren't called. The affidavits, the testimony from men who had been there, weren't examined with anything resembling rigor. The verdict was written before Roberts walked through the door. Morrison replays it on the drive back to Texas. The trail he had followed from St. Louis to Hico, the months of careful investigation, the legal case he'd built with a professional's precision, none of it had mattered. The institutions had spoken. Roberts says little on the journey home. He's diminished, physically, emotionally, something essential extinguished. The stroke, or whatever happened in that room, has taken something from him that won't come back. The old man stares out the window. The Texas landscape scrolls past, flat, dry, indifferent. Somewhere in that silence, whatever fire had driven him to seek the pardon goes out. But the cruelest part of the story was still 28 days away. Before the aftermath, the core tension deserves to be stated plainly. The governor rejected the claim, but he didn't disprove it. There is a difference, a vast, echoing difference. No forensic examination was conducted. The affidavits were never formally challenged in a legal proceeding. The age discrepancy was noted but never conclusively resolved. The hearing didn't answer the question. It simply ended the conversation. Here is what we know for certain. An old man claimed to be Billy the Kid. 5 men who were there said he was. A governor who never examined the evidence said he wasn't. And less than a month later, the old man was dead, taking whatever truth he carried with him into a grave in Hico, Texas. The question isn't whether Roberts was Billy the Kid. The question is whether anyone in that room on November 29, 1950, was genuinely interested in finding out. History pivoted on this single moment, and then chose not to. The hearing was over, but the story was just beginning. December 27, 1950. Less than a month after the ambush that had been waiting for them in the governor's mansion, Brushy Bill Roberts dies of a heart attack in Hico, Texas. 28 days. That's how long the distance was between the worst afternoon of his life and the last one. He was approximately 90 years old, if you believed his story, or approximately 72, if you believed the records. The 20-year gap followed him to the grave. Melinda, the woman who had married him, knowing or believing that she was the wife of Billy the Kid, was with him. Morrison was not. The legal case, such as it was, died with Roberts. There was no deathbed confession, no final revelation, no last words recorded for history, just an old man's heart stopping in a small town in Texas. Silence, stillness, nothing. The man who said he was Billy the Kid died the way most people die. Quietly, without an audience, in a room that history would forget. The most famous outlaw in American history may have died in a small town nobody's heard of. The burial was modest. The small town mourning was brief. The wider world barely noticed. The newspapers that had covered the hearing ran small obituaries, if they ran anything at all. Morrison was left with a binder of affidavits, a rejected petition, and a story no institution would validate. The age of the living outlaw ended, not with a gunshot, but with a quiet heartbeat that simply stopped. But death, it turns out, is not the end of a good mystery. Roberts was not the only impostor or claimant of the era. His story existed within a broader cultural phenomenon that is essential to understanding why the skeptics have a case. Frank Dalton, who had publicly claimed to be Jesse James, appeared alongside Roberts in the late 1940s, a pairing that, to critics, looked less like two aging outlaws finding each other and more like two old men feeding off the same cultural appetite. The 1950s were a golden age of Western mythology, fueled by films and radio serials and the romantic vision of a frontier that had vanished within living memory. Americans were hungry for frontier legends, and men stepped forward to feed that hunger. The Austin American Statesman had reported that Roberts himself briefly claimed Jesse James gang membership before pivoting to the Billy the Kid claim, a detail his supporters say was exaggerated or fabricated by the press, and his detractors say was damning evidence of a man who tried on dead outlaws the way other men tried on hats. In this telling, Roberts was a product of his era, a man swept up in the cultural moment, who either consciously fabricated a legend or, perhaps more tragically, deceived himself into believing it. This is the crux of the skeptic's case, the age discrepancy, the shifting claims, the lack of forensic evidence. The convenient timing, alongside a Western movie revival, it all points, the skeptics say, to an elaborate self-deception or a deliberate hoax. But the believers point to what the skeptics have never been able to explain. The 5 sworn affidavits, testimony from men who had been there, who had no financial incentive to lie, who had watched their friends die in the Lincoln County War, and who said under oath that this old man was Billy. The undocumented knowledge Roberts possessed, the scars that matched, the specificity of stories that no published source contained. These weren't things a fraud could manufacture, the believers argue. These were things only Billy the Kid could know. Morrison spent years after Roberts' death trying to keep the case alive. He published accounts, gave interviews, pushed for further investigation. He became the custodian of a story that had lost its protagonist, a lawyer arguing for a client who could no longer speak. But without Roberts, without the living, breathing, scarred old man who could tell stories that made rooms go silent, the case lost its center of gravity. Evidence without a witness is just paper. Melinda Roberts lived with the knowledge, or the belief, that her husband had been the most famous outlaw in American history, and that the world had refused to believe him. Whether she was a widow grieving a legend, or a woman mourning a man who had deceived even himself, no one can say with certainty. 2 lives shaped by one claim. Morrison, the investigator who followed the evidence and watched it be dismissed, Melinda, the wife who believed, both left with nothing but a story no one in power wanted to hear. The death toll of this battle was not measured in bodies, but in certainties. What followed was not a hearing, but a political execution, and the verdict that emerged from it proved nothing except that institutions protect their narratives. The governor rejected the claim but did not disprove it. No forensic comparison existed. The question, was Brushy Bill Roberts Billy the Kid, remained technically open. The historical consensus was and remains clear. Billy was killed by Pat Garrett in 1881. The weight of evidence, most historians agree, supports that conclusion, but consensus is not proof. And the gap between the two has kept this story breathing for over 70 years. In Hico, Texas, the old man never really died. A downtown marker reads, Ollie L. Brushy Bill Roberts, alias Billy the Kid. There's a museum. There's a gravesite. The town has made its choice. Not necessarily that Roberts was Billy, but that the story matters, that the claim deserves to be remembered, that an old man's insistence carries its own kind of truth, regardless of whether it was the literal kind. Tourists come. They stand in front of the marker. They visit the museum. They ask the question that Robert spent the last year of his life trying to answer, and that the governor spent one chaotic afternoon trying to silence. That same small town in Texas where Morrison first found a scarred old man with impossible stories has become the keeper of those stories, the place where the question is preserved in bronze and glass instead of being buried under institutional convenience. The most haunting aspect of the Brushy Bill Roberts story is not the evidence for or against, it's the evidence that was never gathered. No DNA comparison has been conducted, no exhumation has been performed. The technology to answer the question definitively exists and has existed for decades. The will to use it does not. The graves sit undisturbed. The question persists. The tools to solve this mystery sit on laboratory shelves, waiting for someone with the authority and the courage to use them. But authority, in this case, has always preferred the question to remain unanswered, because a settled question might unsettle everything built on top of it. Return with me, one last time, to the image this story began with, the old man in the doorway of the governor's mansion, the flashbulbs, the hostile room, the shaking hands. In 1950, a man who was either 90 years old or 71, who was either the most famous outlaw in American history or the most committed fraud, walked into a room full of people who had already decided he was lying. He had 5 sworn witnesses, a lifetime of scars, and a 70-year-old promise from a dead governor. He walked out with nothing. The pardon that was promised in 1879 was never delivered, not then, not in 1950, not ever. He didn't want fame. He didn't want money. He wanted the debt paid. Brushy Bill Roberts is buried in Hico, Texas. Billy the Kid is buried in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Whether they're the same person is a question that a single DNA test could answer, and that no one has ever performed. Maybe that's the real mystery. Not whether an old man was telling the truth, but why, after all these years, we're still afraid to find out. The question isn't whether he was Billy. The question is whether anyone wanted to find out. If this story gripped you, subscribe. There are more forgotten mysteries buried in history, and we dig them up